There are moments in war when a battlefield defeat matters less than a logistical collapse. An army can survive losing territory. It can survive losing tanks. Sometimes it can even survive losing thousands of soldiers. But once its supply arteries begin shutting down, the countdown starts. And in southern Ukraine, that countdown may have already begun. Because on 1 June night, Ukraine launched an operation that did not merely damage a Russian port. It attacked the entire system, keeping Russia's southern war machine alive. The target was Mariupol, a city that once symbolized Russia's biggest victory of 2022. A city Putin flattened block by block to seize. A city that became a propaganda monument for the Kremlin. And now, the very port Russia fought so brutally to capture is being turned against them. What makes this story extraordinary is not only the scale of the attack, it is who carried it out. The same Azov fighters who defended Mariupol to the final hour 4 years ago have now returned, not with trenches, not with artillery, but with drones. And this time, they are not defending the city. They are slowly suffocating it. To understand why this strike matters so much, we need to go back to 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin understood something many people outside the military world overlooked. Wars are not won only on front lines. They are won through logistics, through railways, fuel depots, ports, repair hubs, supply corridors. The side that keeps ammunition flowing usually survives longer than the side with better speeches. That is why Mariupol mattered so much. Before the war, Mariupol was one of Ukraine's largest industrial ports on the Sea of Azov. Steel, coal, grain, machinery, all moved through this city. After Russia captured it, the port became something even more valuable, a military logistics platform. Mariupol transformed into a giant resupply hub feeding Russian forces across southern Ukraine and Crimea. And over time, this role became absolutely critical, especially after Ukraine started targeting bridges and railways. The more vulnerable Russian land routes became, the more important Mariupol grew, which is exactly why Ukraine chose to strike it now. The operation began during the night between June 9th and June 10th. But this was not a random drone raid. It was a coordinated systems attack. 3 major Ukrainian elements reportedly participated together. The 1st Azov Corps, special operations units connected to Ukraine's security services, and unmanned systems forces specializing in long-range drone warfare. That coordination tells us something important immediately. This attack was planned weeks, possibly months in advance, because modern infrastructure attacks require precision timing, especially against a defended port. Ukraine reportedly used multiple categories of drones simultaneously. Long-range kamikaze drones approached from different directions. FPV drones targeted infrastructure after defenses became distracted. And autonomous navigation systems allowed many drones to fly low enough to avoid early radar detection. That low-altitude approach matters enormously. Russian air defense systems are strongest when they detect threats early. But drones flying close to terrain create radar shadows. Reaction time shrinks, confusion increases, and once enough drones arrive together, the defense network begins to overload. That is exactly what appears to have happened in Mariupol. Russian Pantsir and Tor systems reportedly engaged incoming targets, but the sheer number of drones forced defenders to divide their fire. Some drones were intercepted, others got through, and the ones that got through did not waste themselves on symbolic targets. They went directly for the port's nervous system. This is the critical difference between a dramatic explosion and a strategically intelligent strike. Ukraine was not trying to create headlines. It was trying to disable functionality. First came the electrical infrastructure, transformer stations, distribution nodes, power connections. The port reportedly lost large sections of operational electricity. That alone creates massive disruption. Ports are not simple docking zones. Modern ports are gigantic machines. Cranes require power, fuel pumps require power, communication systems require power, cooling systems require power. Without electricity, the port begins to choke almost immediately. But Ukraine did not stop there. Radar installations and surveillance systems were also targeted. That matters because ports depend on traffic coordination. A damaged radar network means incoming vessels cannot safely navigate, especially at night, especially during wartime. Even ships that successfully arrive may be forced to wait offshore, and waiting ships become vulnerable ships. Then came another devastating layer: repair infrastructure, maintenance facilities, technical service areas. These are rarely discussed publicly, but they are essential for sustaining military logistics. A damaged truck can be repaired there, a damaged loading crane can be serviced there, generators can be restored there. Destroying repair capacity means even minor future damage becomes harder to fix. The system starts degrading faster over time. Then fuel depots were hit. This was especially significant because Ukraine had already targeted fuel storage near Mariupol days earlier. Reports suggested multiple fuel tanks had already burned in a previous strike. Now the remaining reserves were attacked again. This creates a devastating pattern, not just destruction, repeated destruction, which is psychologically and operationally exhausting for defenders. Every time Russia repairs something, Ukraine returns. Every repair becomes temporary. Every restoration becomes uncertain. And finally, one of the most politically sensitive targets was struck: a cargo vessel reportedly connected to Russia's shadow shipping network. These ships have become increasingly important for Moscow, because despite sanctions, Russia still needs routes to export resources from occupied territories: grain, metal, coal, industrial goods. Mariupol became one of the gateways enabling that system, which means the attack was not only military, it was economic warfare too. And perhaps that is the most important thing happening in this war right now. Ukraine is no longer thinking only in terms of battlefield victories. It is targeting sustainability, the ability of Russia to continue the war efficiently over time. That is a completely different strategic philosophy. For most of 2022, Ukraine fought reactively. Russia attacked. Ukraine defended. In 2023, Ukraine proved it could conduct deep strikes. The Crimean Bridge attacks demonstrated reach, but many of those operations were isolated blows. Painful for Russia? Yes, but survivable. What changed later was Ukraine's understanding of systems warfare. Instead of asking, how do we destroy one target, Ukraine began asking, how do we slowly collapse the entire network? That shift changes everything, because wars are not maintained by single structures. They are maintained by interconnected systems. Destroy one bridge, traffic reroutes. Destroy one depot, supplies move elsewhere, but damage multiple connected systems simultaneously, and the strain multiplies. That appears to be the logic behind the Mariupol operation, and the consequences stretch far beyond one port. Russia currently maintains massive troop concentrations across southern Ukraine, forces in Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson sectors, Crimea itself. All require enormous amounts of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, and transport support. And the logistics burden is becoming increasingly difficult, especially because Ukraine has systematically targeted alternative routes for months. The Chongar crossings came under repeated attack. Rail connections faced disruption. Ferries were struck. Road corridors increasingly fell under drone surveillance. Some routes became dangerous enough that Russian military traffic reportedly had to reduce movement patterns. And that is what made Mariupol so valuable. It helped relieve pressure. It provided another entry point, another artery, another mechanism keeping southern operations functioning. Now that artery is under severe strain, and timing matters here, because the same night Mariupol was hit, reports also emerged of strikes against ammunition infrastructure connected to Russian military formations elsewhere in the south. That combination is dangerous. Ports matter. Ammunition depots matter. Fuel reserves matter. But when all three categories begin facing simultaneous pressure, logistics transforms into crisis management. And once an army starts constantly reacting to shortages, transportation risks, and infrastructure losses, operational flexibility begins shrinking. That does not mean collapse happens overnight. This is important. Russia is still capable of adaptation. Throughout the war, Moscow has repeatedly shown it can absorb damage longer than many analysts expected. Temporary bridges get built, generators get moved, routes get rerouted, repairs happen, but adaptation itself consumes resources: time, money, engineering capacity, security personnel, transport equipment. And Ukraine understands this. In many ways, the goal is no longer simply destruction, it is exhaustion, making every repair expensive, making every supply route vulnerable, making every logistics officer uncertain. Because uncertainty creates hesitation, and hesitation slows everything. One of the most fascinating aspects of this transformation is how inexpensive it can be compared to traditional warfare. Russia spent enormous military resources capturing Mariupol in 2022. Months of brutal urban combat, massive artillery expenditure, airstrikes, thousands of casualties, entire districts destroyed. Ukraine, meanwhile, is now threatening the functionality of that same city with comparatively cheap drones. That asymmetry matters enormously because modern drone warfare is rewriting military economics. A target worth billions can sometimes be disrupted by systems costing tens of thousands. And unlike missiles, drones can be produced in large numbers relatively quickly. This creates a sustainability advantage for the attacker, especially when defending every target becomes impossible. And Mariupol is far from the front line. That is another critical psychological factor. For years, Russia portrayed rear logistic zones as relatively secure. Front lines were dangerous. Deep rear areas were safer. Ukraine is gradually erasing that distinction. Mariupol sits roughly 80 kilometers from active combat sectors. Yet even there, infrastructure is now vulnerable. That changes military calculations dramatically, because every kilometer previously considered safe depth becomes questionable. And once rear areas become unstable, frontline stability eventually follows. There is also a symbolic dimension here that cannot be ignored. Mariupol is not just another occupied city. For both sides, it became emotional terrain. For Russia, capturing it symbolized conquest. For Ukraine, losing it symbolized sacrifice, especially because of Azovstal. The siege became globally recognized. For weeks, the world watched Ukrainian defenders trapped underground while Russian bombardment pulverized the city above them. The Azov fighters became central figures in that story. Some were killed, others captured. Many endured imprisonment. Russia celebrated their surrender as proof Ukrainian resistance had been crushed. But history and war rarely moves in straight lines, because now, years later, those same formations are again shaping events around Mariupol, only this time through drone warfare. And that may represent the deepest transformation of all. Ukraine learned it cannot always match Russia conventionally, so it evolved asymmetrically. Instead of competing tank for tank, it competes system against system. Instead of trying to overpower Russia everywhere, it targets vulnerability. Instead of frontal assaults, it applies pressure across logistics networks. This is no longer just battlefield warfare, it is infrastructure warfare. And Mariupol may become one of its defining examples. Because if Ukraine can repeatedly threaten ports, bridges, railways, fuel reserves, and repair systems simultaneously, then Russia faces a growing dilemma: protect the front or protect the rear, defend soldiers or defend infrastructure, move air defenses closer to combat, or keep them guarding ports and logistics hubs. Every choice creates another weakness somewhere else, and that is exactly what Ukraine wants. Not necessarily immediate collapse, but strategic overstretch, a condition where Russia must defend too many critical systems at the same time. And wars of overstretch eventually become wars of attrition, not only for armies, but for economies, for political narratives, and for public confidence. Because the Kremlin spent years presenting occupied territories as secure and permanently integrated, yet now even flagship logistics centers are vulnerable to recurring strikes. That damages perception, and perception matters in long wars, especially when elections, domestic morale, and military recruitment all depend partly on the image of control. The deeper question now is not whether Russia can repair Mariupol. It probably can, at least partially. The deeper question is whether Ukraine will allow those repairs to survive long enough to matter. And so far, The pattern suggests something very dangerous for Moscow. Ukraine is no longer conducting isolated raids. It is conducting cycles of pressure. Strike, repair attempt, strike again, repeat. And over time, that cycle slowly drains capacity, not in dramatic cinematic fashion, but in the quiet, grinding way logistic systems die. And if that process continues across southern Ukraine and Crimea simultaneously, then the real battle of 2026 may not be fought on trenches at all. It may be fought on roads, ports, fuel depots, and repair yards hidden far behind the front line. Because in modern war, whoever controls logistics controls time, and whoever loses time eventually loses options. But even while Ukraine's strategy appears increasingly effective, one dangerous mistake must be avoided, assuming Russia is close to collapse. That assumption has destroyed military predictions repeatedly throughout this war. Again and again, analysts declared Russia was running out of missiles, running out of tanks, running out of manpower, and yet Moscow adapted. Not elegantly, not efficiently, but sufficiently. And that distinction matters, because a state does not need to operate perfectly to continue fighting. It only needs to operate long enough. That is why the real question after the Mariupol strike is not, can Russia survive this? It is, how expensive will survival become? Because survival is becoming increasingly costly, financially, militarily, politically, and psychologically. To understand why, we need to look at what Ukraine is actually building here. This is no longer a campaign of isolated drone attacks. It is the construction of a logistical siege, not a siege around one city, a siege around an entire military system, and Crimea sits at the center of it. For years, Crimea functioned as Russia's protected fortress in the Black Sea. After the 2014 annexation, Moscow poured massive resources into militarizing the peninsula. Air defense systems, naval bases, fuel reserves, radar networks, command centers, bridges, rail links. The peninsula became both a symbol and a launch platform. But geography creates a hidden vulnerability. Crimea depends heavily on external supply lines, especially during large-scale war. And Ukraine has spent the last 3 years systematically attacking those lines one by one. First came the Crimean bridge strikes. Even when the bridge remained standing, traffic disruptions mattered. Heavy transport slowed, repair resources multiplied, security burdens expanded. Then came attacks on naval infrastructure. Sea drones changed the balance in the Black Sea completely. Russia's fleet, once dominant, began withdrawing farther from danger zones. Ships moved, patrol patterns changed. Command structures adapted, and every adaptation revealed another weakness. Then Ukraine expanded pressure onto land corridors, bridges near Chongar, crossings near Henichesk, rail connections, fuel transport routes. None of these attacks individually destroyed Russian logistics, but together they began compressing options. That is the key word here, compression. Wars are often decided not by total destruction, but by shrinking flexibility. An army with 5 supply routes feels stable. An army with 2 routes feels pressured. An army with 1 route becomes predictable. And predictability in war is dangerous, because predictable movement patterns are easier to target. That appears to be exactly what Ukraine is attempting, not a dramatic overnight encirclement, a gradual tightening. And Mariupol fits directly into this strategy, because once the port's operational capacity drops, the burden shifts elsewhere. More trucks on vulnerable roads, more dependency on the Kerch Bridge, more strain on secondary infrastructure, more pressure on already stressed logistics officers, and that creates cumulative effects. Fuel delays here, ammunition shortages there, repair backlogs elsewhere, none individually catastrophic, but together, corrosive. This is why the operation matters far beyond physical destruction. It reveals Ukraine's evolving doctrine, a doctrine centered on sustainability warfare. The idea is simple. Instead of trying to defeat Russia through one decisive battlefield breakthrough, make the war increasingly difficult for Russia to sustain over time. This approach aligns closely with a concept many Western military planners quietly discussed for years: The idea that modern great power conflict may depend less on territorial gains and more on infrastructure endurance. Whose systems fail first? Whose economy bends first? Whose logistics network becomes too strained to maintain operational tempo? Ukraine appears increasingly focused on forcing Russia into that dilemma, and what makes this especially dangerous for Moscow is the economic asymmetry involved. A drone costing tens of thousands of dollars can disable infrastructure worth millions, sometimes billions, and repairs are never truly final. That is the nightmare. Every repaired facility becomes a future target. This creates a vicious cycle. Russia spends resources restoring infrastructure. Ukraine strikes it again. Russia rebuilds again. Ukraine returns again. Over time, the defending side bleeds resources simply maintaining functionality, and in prolonged wars, maintenance itself becomes exhausting. There is also a manpower problem hidden beneath the surface. Repairing infrastructure during wartime is not easy. You need engineers, electrical specialists, construction crews, transport personnel, security teams, air defense coverage, spare components. And many of those resources are already heavily strained across Russia's war economy, especially because the front itself constantly consumes personnel and equipment. This creates a dangerous balancing act. Repair the rear, reinforce the front, maintain industrial production, protect strategic facilities, all simultaneously. That burden becomes even heavier under continuous drone pressure. Because unlike traditional missile campaigns, drones create persistent uncertainty. Missiles are expensive. Drone attacks can be repeated far more often. That frequency changes the psychological environment completely. Workers become nervous. Convoys delay movement. Commanders hesitate. Insurance costs rise. Shipping patterns change. Even civilian infrastructure managers begin operating differently. And this matters because war is not only fought with weapons, it is fought with confidence. The side that feels increasingly unsafe behind its own lines begins operating defensively everywhere. And Russia now faces a growing rear security problem stretching from Crimea to deep logistical zones. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this transformation is how rapidly warfare itself is changing. In 2022, Russia captured territory primarily through conventional force, heavy armor, massed artillery, airstrikes, large infantry assaults, traditional military power. But by 2026, Ukraine is demonstrating something radically different: the ability to strategically threaten infrastructure without occupying it. That is revolutionary. Historically, controlling logistics usually required controlling territory. Now, drones are changing that equation. You may physically hold a port, but can you safely operate it? You may control a bridge, but can you reliably use it? You may possess a fuel depot, but can you keep it functioning continuously? That distinction between possession and usability is becoming one of the defining realities of modern warfare, and Russia is learning this lesson in real time. Mariupol illustrates it perfectly. Russia still occupies the city. Russian flags still fly there. Russian forces still patrol there. But if the port cannot function reliably, then strategic control becomes weaker than it appears on maps. And maps can be deceptive, especially in wars driven increasingly by reach rather than proximity. This is where Ukraine's drone doctrine becomes especially important, because Ukraine has transformed drones from tactical tools into strategic instruments. At first, drones mainly supported reconnaissance. Then came strike missions. Then naval drones. Now coordinated infrastructure campaigns. Each stage expanded what drones could achieve. And perhaps most importantly, Ukraine industrialized the process. Mass production changed everything. A few drones create headlines. Hundreds create operational pressure. Thousands create systemic instability. That appears to be where this war is heading, toward industrial-scale drone conflict. And Russia understands the danger. That is why air defenses have increasingly been pulled deeper into rear zones. But this creates another dilemma. Every air defense battery protecting infrastructure is one less system protecting frontline troops. Every radar covering ports is a radar unavailable elsewhere. And modern wars punish overstretched defense networks because attackers choose where to strike. Defenders must protect everything. That imbalance favors initiative, and right now, Ukraine increasingly possesses initiative in the deep strike domain. Still, Russia retains advantages too. Its industrial capacity remains significant. Its manpower pool is larger. Its allies continue providing support. China supplies critical industrial components and dual-use technologies that sustain Russian production lines. North Korea reportedly continues assisting with ammunition supplies. Iranian drone expertise influenced Russia's own strike programs. This network matters. It increases Russia's endurance, and endurance is critical in long wars, but even allied support has limitations. Foreign partners can provide weapons, technology, components, ammunition. What they cannot easily provide is secure geography. They cannot erase vulnerability. And southern Russian logistics are increasingly vulnerable, especially around Crimea and the Sea of Azov. That vulnerability creates another dangerous long-term possibility: operational isolation. Not necessarily complete encirclement, but increasing difficulty sustaining large force concentrations efficiently. And large armies consume astonishing quantities of material every single day. Fuel alone becomes enormous. Then ammunition, vehicle parts, medical supplies, food, engineering equipment, communication systems, generators, lubricants. Everything multiplies across hundreds of thousands of troops, which is why logistics failures can become strategically fatal long before front lines visibly collapse. History proves this repeatedly. Armies rarely announce, "We are collapsing." Instead, small failures accumulate quietly. Convoys slow, maintenance delays grow, fuel shortages increase, equipment availability drops, operational tempo weakens, and eventually battlefield performance begins degrading. That process can take months, sometimes years, but once momentum turns negative, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult. Ukraine seems increasingly focused on accelerating exactly that process, and perhaps the most symbolic aspect of all this is who is leading parts of it. Azov. 4 years ago, Mariupol represented their tragedy. Now, the same name is tied to Russia's logistical vulnerability there. That transformation carries enormous symbolic power inside Ukraine because it reinforces a narrative of endurance: lose territory, adapt, return differently. This has become one of Ukraine's defining wartime characteristics: flexibility. When conventional approaches failed, Ukraine evolved. Sea drones changed naval warfare. Cheap FPV drones transformed battlefield attrition. Long-range strikes expanded operational reach. And now infrastructure warfare is becoming the next phase. What we may be witnessing is not simply a campaign against Russian logistics, but the emergence of a new model of warfare itself. One where relatively inexpensive autonomous systems continuously pressure critical infrastructure across vast distances. One where rear areas are never truly secure. One where supply systems become front lines. And one where economic endurance matters as much as territorial control. That is why Mariupol matters, not only because of the damage done, but because of what the operation represents: a preview, a signal, a warning of how future wars may increasingly be fought. And for Russia, the implications are serious, because every occupied city depends on infrastructure, every military grouping depends on supply, every logistics chain depends on predictability. And predictability is exactly what Ukraine is trying to destroy. One strike at a time, one bridge at a time, one fuel depot at a time, one port at a time. The frightening reality for Moscow is this: Ukraine does not necessarily need to fully destroy Russian logistics. It may only need to make them permanently unstable, because instability changes strategic behavior. It slows offensives, complicates planning, raises costs, damages morale, and gradually transforms military momentum. That is why the Mariupol strike may end up being remembered as far more than another drone attack. It may represent a turning point in how infrastructure warfare shapes the future of this conflict, because Putin understood something correctly from the beginning. Ports are the heart of logistics. What he underestimated was how vulnerable that heart would become in the drone age. A city conquered through months of brutal warfare can now be strategically crippled in a single night. Not by bombers, not by fleets, but by swarms of relatively cheap autonomous systems. That is the new reality of modern war. And every military on Earth is watching it unfold, because the lessons being learned over Mariupol today will shape military doctrine far beyond Ukraine tomorrow. We will continue following every major development and bringing you deeper strategic analysis. Subscribe to Stylish Informer and stay ahead of the headlines with detailed military breakdowns, geopolitical insight, and the hidden dynamics shaping the battlefield. And if you enjoy listening to long-form analysis while driving, working, or traveling, Stylish Informer is also expanding onto audio platforms, so you can stay informed wherever you are.